I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. There may be no more precocious, go-getting newspaper man in America than today's guest, 24-year-old Wesley Lowery, whom the National Association of Black Journalists named the 2014 Emerging Journalist of the Year. Currently a congressional and national political reporter for the Washington Post, Lowery covers Congress, campaigns, and other election-related news. He previously staffed the Boston Globe's Metro desk and contributed to its Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing, endangering himself to report from fear-stricken Boston, the most visible ground zero of terrorism since the 9/11 attacks. I followed in real time Lowery's all-night posts during the standoff between law enforcement and the bomb suspects, and I have to credit him with the deftest journalistic use of Twitter I've come across. If you have a moment, visit him at Wesley Lowery to retrace his tweets on that fateful night in Boston. His feature stories and analysis are among the most buzzed about on the web, but they are also among the meatiest and most thoughtful scoops. Today we'll venture with Wesley Lowery into the modern-day reporter's notebook from his past Boston Globe and current Washington Post tenure, as he analyzes his own and others' coverage of the 2014 midterm campaign. I specifically want to ask Wesley Lowery about his political calculus and whether the outcomes of this midterm election cycle will prove decisive in whom we elect as an electoral map in 2016. Wesley?
Excellent. Thanks for having me, Alexander. I think that I think it's really interesting to look at 2014 and how it propels itself into 2016. I think that in 2014, we will really have a Republican year, very likely. The Republicans have a great chance of taking the Senate. They will most likely pick up seats in the House. And so it would be the first time in the Obama administration that he faces a Congress that he has no control over whatsoever. And I think that it's going to be very interesting because the map is very different in 2016. While the Republicans could take the Senate in 2014, the Democrats are very likely going to win it right back in 2016. Most interesting, however, will be how the players in 2016, especially on the Republican side, how they can begin to position themselves to run come the presidential election. And so you see people have watched very closely how players like Ted Cruz, how Rand Paul, how Marco Rubio have interacted with 2014 candidates, who they have endorsed, what races they've stayed out of, and how some of them who are seen as more Tea Party candidates have tried to endear themselves with the establishment, and how establishment candidates have tried to underscore their conservative credentials. And I think that as far as 2016 is concerned, that's the biggest takeaway of 2014. Not necessarily, if and when the Republicans have a good November. It's not, there will be some analysis out there that says, what does this mean for 2016? And people are going to say, well, it means the Republicans are on the way up and they're going to have a great year in 2016. I wouldn't buy all of that. I think the Democrats, the demographics of the electoral map still widely favor the Democrats of 2016, especially with who we believe the candidates might be. But I think the influence in 2016 will be these candidates who will be running on the right and how they can position themselves.
In 2012, and after the presidential election and President Obama's successful re-election victory, there was an effort made by the chairman of the RNC, the Republican National Committee, to unify the party. But that doesn't seem to have happened.
Not at all. I think that if you look at every single interesting primary this year, they're all on the Republican side, and they're all a conservative or Tea Party candidate taking on an incumbent. You've got so many of these races, and top to bottom of the slate. Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader, who would be the Senate majority leader were the Republicans to take over, has to deal with a Tea Party challenger before he has to deal with a hard Democratic challenger. And so there certainly does not seem to be this unity. Now, granted, it's very hard to achieve that unity in off-election years. I think you will very likely see some unity behind whomever the 2016 candidate is on the Republican side. But right now, you still really do have an ideological splinter. I think that when you look at the Republicans, you have a small wing of the Republican Party, the most conservative wing of the Republican Party, has an outsized power and influence over the policies, actions, and candidates of the broader party. And so that's where that splinter is. It's not this massive civil war. It's a handful of people. If the whole Republican Party were 10 people, it's the 2 people who refuse to vote with the other 8. And I think that that's what the Republicans continue to run up against and continue to deal with. Now, will those two people jump back into the camp come 2016 to vote against whomever the Democrat is, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden? I'm pretty sure they will. But in the meantime, it makes some real tug of wars between where this party is headed and what they're doing.
Based on your reporting in Washington, do you sense how this will ultimately resolve itself? I mean, will we have to wait until 2016 and see if there's an isolationist or internationalist Republican presidential nominee?
I do think that we're in a lot of ways, we're going to have to wait and see, only because there are a lot of moving dynamics in the Republican field. And again, I'm much more interested, frankly, in the Republican field than I am in the Democratic field this year, because I do think this is a much more pivotal election for the Republicans than it is for the Democrats. I think when you look at the potential Republican field, you have a lot of people who we think we know, but we don't really know yet. We know Marco Rubio. We don't really know Marco Rubio yet. He's never had to run a national campaign. He's never had to talk on a large swath of issues with a camera in his face every single day. I think that will be very interesting. I think you have people like Ted Cruz and Rand Paul. Ted Cruz, who we very much believe we know and who will likely stay exactly the way he is throughout much of the campaign, compared to Rand Paul, someone who we all thought we knew as this type of libertarian, kind of isolationist, kind of in the same model as his father, Ron Paul, who is now very actively and very deliberately moderated his stances, moderated his policy, and is talking about things that he hopes will, one, help him win the establishment, and two, help him bring in minorities and women. And so I think that it's going to be fascinating to see the evolution of some of these younger candidates, and then also to see how this field shapes up. Does Jeb Bush get in? Does Scott Walker get in? Does John Kasich get in? What is the Republican field? And I think that remains the biggest question mark. There are people we know are going to run, and then there are a lot of people who, if they ran, could change the game.
And what's your best bet?
History tells us that the Republicans are most likely to put up an establishment Republican. I think that I do think, and it's hard because this is kind of punting on the answer, but I do think that history also tells us they'll do one of two things. Now, this will either be a John McCain, Mitt Romney type nominee, someone who is certainly fiscal conservative, but more of a moderate, someone who does not play on social issues in the same way, but who is seen as a competent manager. Or it could be a Barry Goldwater election. If someone like Ted Cruz is nominated, it'll be the single most conservative nominee since Barry Goldwater. Now, if we remember, Barry Goldwater got beat more handily than any other nominee, but it certainly could be a Back to the Future type return to the roots nomination if the Republicans can really drum up the support on the far right. Now, I would question if that's possible. They couldn't do it in 2012. Following the Tea Party insurgents of 2010, the conservatives have never had more power in the Republican Party than they did in 2010, 2011, and yet the most conservative person they could get through the primaries was Mitt Romney. And so my best guess, and what the reporting in history has bared out so far, is that we're very likely going to see someone emerging from the Republican ranks who is a more middle-of-the-road establishment Republican. And I think that one of the biggest indications that that's the way the wind blowing is that someone like Rand Paul is working so hard to moderate himself. If he thought he could win as a far-right conservative, as a Tea Party insurgent, he'd be trying to become Ted Cruz. And he's not, and I think that's telling.
Back to the underlying question, though. In terms of 2014's impact on the 2016 race, doesn't a lot of that have to do with if the Republicans are elected and become a majority party in both chambers, what they do with that power?
It's huge, and I think that's one of the fascinating and one of the most unexplored concepts is that, imagine for a moment that it's January 2015 and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is walking to the microphone. What's he saying? What's their agenda? What will they do? I had a lunch with a conservative activist a few months ago where we sat and we talked about, let's just have a hypothetical conversation about comprehensive immigration reform is going to pass. When do the Republicans do it? Can everyone says after the midterms they'll come around. Can the first thing a Republican Congress accomplishes really be comprehensive immigration reform? I think there's a real question about that. I think
because that might splinter the party further.
Even further, even worse than if they did it prior to. If the Republicans have been waiting for so long to have control of the House and the Senate, and the first thing they do is something the Democrats wanted to do and that they were obstructing, I think there'd be real insurrection among some of the far right. And so the question then becomes, if you can't do it first, but you think you need to do it eventually, when do you do it? The calendar is only so long, and especially in 2015, how do you do it without making it a 2016 issue? If Congress is actively considering comprehensive immigration reform legislation as candidates are going to the primary stage, it potentially splinters your party's candidates, as opposed to something that would have already been passed or is not passed, in which case these candidates can talk about it in broad hypotheticals. If you put legislation on the floor of Congress during the primary, that means every candidate on that stage has to answer, would you vote for it? And some of them will have to vote for it one way or the other. Or would you veto this as President of the United States? I don't know that any Republican, no matter where they stand on immigration reform, wants to have that conversation publicly on debate stages, because it only exposes them to the type of caricaturing that's going to hurt them in a general election, no matter who the candidate is.
And potential ugliness if you have someone radical or extreme who says something that is offensive.
That is, and all it takes is one candidate to go on a rant about illegals. All it takes is one candidate to say
and that's still happening.
And it is, and anytime you have an unnecessary conversation on things like race and ethnicity, anytime you walk into muddy waters you don't need to walk into. That's not to say we don't need to have a full, robust conversation about immigration, or a full, robust conversation about race and ethnicity for that matter. But in the same way, the Republican candidates on the stage in 2016 should not be having the same border fence conversations that the candidates in 2000 and 2004 and 2008 and 2012 were having. At this point, the Republicans need to turn this corner, and it's the question of, will they be able institutionally to do that, or will these candidates be forced to have the same conversations? And if they are forced to have the same conversations, I can't see that helping them.
So let me ask you, do you think Republicans, based on your reporting, are strategizing about these very questions post-2014 now?
I think they are. I mean, I think that a lot of people are strategizing, and I think a lot of people within the Republican Party. I think that often when we talk about Republicans or Democrats, we think that it's this big club of people who all get together. I think there are people, different segments. I think that the House leadership is huddling and strategizing in a certain way. I think Mitch McConnell and the potential Senate leadership is huddling and strategizing a certain way. I think Reince Priebus at the RNC is huddling and strategizing a certain way. Now, of course, they all talk in some capacity, but I think there are a lot of, if you talk to 10 top-level Republicans about how this would play out, I think you would get 9 to 10 very different answers. But I do think they are very proactive about trying to figure out how they're going to do this. Will they do it the right way, or will they do it well? Will they pull it off? There's a question that remains to be seen, but I do think that the Republicans cannot be accused of not being deliberate and of not having thought this through. It's just a question of, will they be able to pull it off?
As a congressional reporter, you encounter daily, I'm sure, the dysfunction of both chambers. So expound on that. I mean, seemingly there is constant dysfunction. The gerrymandering problem has further polarized our two-party system. Does the millennial press corps of political reporters have answers that the traditional old guard reporters don't really possess, in terms of asking questions that are going to prove to be important, not because they're important questions, but they'll also be critical in advancing debate in what has become this sluggish slugfest of Congress?
When I look at the Congressional Press Corps, of which I've only been a member a few months, and so I don't want to make any too broad, sweeping statements, but with that said, when I look at the Congressional Press Corps, I see a real balance between the younger millennial press corps and the old guard press corps of the people who've been there, the real deans of the press corps who are privileged to work with. And I think the balance there is that, especially in the media environment we have now, where we have so many publications, so many outlets, not just the Capitol Hill newspapers like The Hill or Roll Call or CQ, but also just National Journal, who at times has dozens of people up on the Hill, outlets like that, Politico, dozens of people. What it does is it allows good journalism to be done on a lot of issues that otherwise would be ignored, different angles to be explored that otherwise would be ignored. And so on any given issue, whether it's minimum wage, whether it's immigration, whether it's, no matter what it is, or the Bergdahl release and how Congress was briefed on it or not briefed on it, when you now have 100 reporters reporting on it, and 20 to, actually not even 20, and 75 of them are millennials, the lion's share are younger, vibrant people, it really in some ways shapes a narrative and allows new questions to be asked that might not have been asked otherwise, because any two journalists come into any situation with a different perspective, different ideas, sometimes a different agenda, but that in totality, having this broad mosaic of different reporters, many of whom are young reporters really driving this conversation, I do think it helps us get to questions and get to answers and potentially solutions to things that otherwise might not be explored on Capitol
Well,
Hill.
you hit on it, because are younger reporters more solution-driven, not insofar as they have an agenda to affect the outcome of pending legislation, but because they see how their millennial counterparts outside of the public sector react to news about Congress with such disgust?
Well, of course. I mean, we don't, and I think a lot of that is just the changing times. I think that now, millennials have grown up in a generation where we have so many options. It's never been easier to feel like you were informed and be less informed. Because every one of us, when we open our email browser, sees 3 headlines, or every one of us watches The Daily Show sometimes, or every one of us, and so it's very easy to feel as if we have a broad understanding of things and actually not know anything about anything. And I think because I think millennials, especially millennial reporters, recognize and understand that. And because of that, we know that in some ways we've got to push the issue a little bit harder with elected officials or on certain issues and make things be more solutions oriented, because we know in order to get the readership and the populace to care, it can't be spin, it can't be nonsense. You have a political class of people who follow it for the sport of following it. And there's certainly plenty of coverage for them. But I think in terms of actually influencing change and making things happen, I think that we do see a lot, especially among younger reporters, who just don't have the propensity to take the spin the same way, because it doesn't matter. We're not in this for the support of it necessarily. We're in this to influence change in the country we live in.
How do you fight back against the finger-pointing, the scapegoating, and all of these malevolent forces that intersect in Washington, D.C.?
I think that you just have to, and I try to be very deliberate about keeping a healthy sense of skepticism. I think that it's very easy when you, for example, work in the Capitol building, and you can go days and not talk to anyone who doesn't work in the Capitol building. The House is going to vote on something, and so you stand and you talk to the Republican operatives as the vote's happening, and they tell you X, Y, and Z. You walk to the other end of the chamber, talk to the Democratic operatives, and they tell you X, Y, and Z. And they both said all types of things, and you can either believe the things they're saying, and you can buy into that, and that's where I think we get a lot of the kind of back and forth horse race coverage we get. Or you can listen to have those conversations, and you can step back and say, okay, as an objective human being, which of those things are just abstractly ridiculous, and which of those things make sense, and which of them don't? And I think that there really is a balancing act to be done between stenography and real-time analysis and reported analysis, and taking a look at something and saying, I'm the person who's had these conversations, I'm going to tell you what this means and what this doesn't mean. When the Republicans say this, it really means X, Y, and Z. When the Democrats say this, it really means X, Y, and Z. And I think that that's important. I think that pulling that veil back behind the play politics and trying to show motivations or trying to show the strategy of the parties is a way to provide more honest coverage.
In this political world, there's PolitiFact, there are the 4 Pinocchios, and you tell our viewers about some of the emails you get from elected officials and their representatives.
Well, of course. I mean, I think that they vary. I mean, emails, phone calls, text messages, tweets, you get a lot of feedback.
But there's a lot of showmanship.
A ton of it.
And womanship.
A ton. I mean, I think that they're all peacocks. They're all, and I think that is something that really does in some ways influence coverage, but also is something you have to be vigilant about as you cover these elected officials, is that you understand, I covered a prominent senator giving a speech maybe a month or 2 ago, and I got a lot of pushback from one of his lead aides on very minute wordings. So, no, he didn't clarify this, no, he didn't walk back, and it's like, come on. And I think that often in traditional journalism, we're very inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to people who are pushed to the subjects of our stories. And I think that sometimes, especially, and I'm fortunate to work at a place like the Washington Post that, one, gives me a lot of freedom and is willing to back me up. But I think we also have to have confidence in the authority of who we are. So if I say the senator clarified something because it was unclear previously, now his spokespeople, his people who are crafting his messaging may not like that word. And frankly, I don't care. And I shouldn't care. Because if it was unclear previously and he said something to make it more clear, the word I should use is clarify. And I think that those are the types of decisions that we have to make at a day in, day out basis on things as small as a word like that to things that are much larger, about large policy stances, about those types of things.
President Obama has convened congressional meetings at the White House, summits, golf outings with Republican leaders. Very little of it seems to have worked. I mean, is that your, would you
Yes,
agree with
that would be my assessment. I think that I think President Obama has seemingly has a very cold relationship with Capitol Hill. Frankly, both Democrats and Republicans. I think that a good example that we've seen this play out very recently in the release of Bo Bergdahl, the Army sergeant who was in Taliban captivity, because the Obama administration, while it seems that President Obama as the commander-in-chief had the option to not give them the required 30-day notification, that it may or may not have been a skirting of the law, but as John McCain said to me yesterday, he's the commander-in-chief. Setting that aside, he didn't even make courtesy phone calls to some top Democrats to just say, hey, by the way, we're not giving you the heads up, but just so you know this is happening. Our understanding is that some of the top members of Congress found out about this major operation that may or may not have superseded the law and superseded the requirement to tell Congress, and some of them found out about it on television. And so there certainly does seem to be a severed relationship between the Obama administration and Capitol Hill, not just the Republicans, also some of the Democrats.
So what would further the cause of bipartisanship into a next administration, whether that's a Jeb Bush administration or a Hillary Clinton administration?
I think that there just needs to be there has to be due diligence done to build those relationships. I think that there has to be a perceived willingness by the leaders on Capitol Hill that whomever the president is truly interested in bipartisanship and working. I think that if you look at President Obama when he came in and was elected in 2008, he talked very broadly in large sweeping statements about bipartisanship and fixing Washington and not being politics as usual and working with the Hill and getting things passed. And when he ran into a Republican Congress that was not very willing to compromise with him, he essentially said, okay, I'm going to supersede Congress on many issues. And I think that that has done is it has hardened both players in this, and to the point where neither is really willing to come back and make deals here. I think that whomever the next president is, I think
what is due diligence?
I think part of it's as simple as just maintaining at the staff level, maintaining relationships.
And you think that has been sacrificed?
I think that
there's a facade of engagement on the part of the president that hasn't been real.
That hasn't necessarily that aides on the Hill do not interpret as having been real, because it's not the media they have to fool. It's not the public they have to fool. They have to, if you have to work with someone, you have to be on their team. It doesn't matter from the outside, it looks like the team is functioning. The team has to actually be functioning. And I think that is part of what the problem has been. But I also, to walk that back a little bit, I think you also have to look at the dynamics President Obama has faced. He's had to deal with especially a Republican House that has been splintered in among itself. The Republican House leadership has had to deal with insurrection among its own ranks, and it's put them in a harder position in terms of negotiating on some of these things. And so the dynamics here are constantly moving and constantly changing. I don't know that there's blame to be laid specifically on the Obama administration versus Congress versus the Republicans in the House versus the Democrats in the Senate, but I do think it's a fair observation to say that it has not worked the way that 2008 Senator Barack Obama declared it was going to work.
Well, it appears to me that due diligence could be a futile endeavor if there is this ideological gridlock.
I think that's fair. I think that, but I think that...
And that's not something you, as a reporter, can necessarily tackle. And if that's at the heart of this conundrum...
And that is at the heart of the conundrum on a lot of issues. If you look at a lot of issues, whether it be the extension of emergency unemployment, for example, where the Republicans in the House, just at an ideological level, do not believe it's something we should do. And so it's not even necessarily a playing politics. It's the Democrats want to do this thing, and we just do not believe it's the solution to the problem. And so, but I think that the difference here, though, is there's been real difficulty during the Obama years, and especially during the second term of the Obama administration, in Congress really finding the areas where they can work together and really being willing to come to the table on things. And I think that, often we talk about immigration reform is a good example of this. John Boehner, Speaker of the House, constantly talks about how his caucus does not trust the President of the United States to enforce the laws of the land, and therefore they would not trust him on immigration reform. Now, Democrats will always push back on that and say that's nonsense, it doesn't make any sense. Of course, the president's going to enforce the laws and X, Y, and Z. But I do believe that there is, especially among the rank and file, a distrust of the President of the United States on a lot of issues, whether that issue be how the Affordable Care Act was rolled out, and now things like the Bergdahl release, where the President of the United States has essentially decided that it's an untenable relationship between him and Congress, and so he's going to just try to get a lot of things done on his agenda. And the more times you go down that checklist and he hasn't necessarily consulted Congress or jumped through the hoops that way, the less the people on that side in Congress are going to trust him. And so I do think there are some real severed relationships here in this administration, and it's unclear, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, if whoever the next commander-in-chief, whoever the next president of the United States is, if they're going to be able to, they'll have a clean slate at the very least, but if they'll be able to navigate these waters a little bit better.
Wesley Lowery, I know you'll continue to do yeoman's work on the Hill, and I hope the next time you join us, if you will,
Of course.
the government will be less divided.
We can both hope.
Thank you, Wes. And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other Open Mind interviews.